Okay, so welcome to our Media and Politics Group online seminar. We're delighted that this time we've got Nat Jester from the University of Gloucestershire, and Nat is a lecturer in sociology and criminology, and I think that really speaks to the way in which media and politics is kind of cuts across lots of fields and disciplines, actually. So Nat's interests are in security and identity, particularly in digital spaces. And I wanted to note as well her excellent article on army recruitment campaigns across the US and the UK. This is an article that I know my students really have appreciated, and lots of them enjoy looking at the recruitment campaigns, particularly the belonging campaigns and the way in which military recruitment has shifted from what Nat writes about, which is that kind of hegemonic military masculinity. And now we're seeing this shift to inclusivity and diversity. And so in a way that kind of leads very nicely to the paper today that she's going to talk about as well, which also looks at martial politics, but the way in which it's visible and invisible in arms manufacturers' tweets. So Nat's going to introduce the article and give a short presentation, and then we'll have time for questions as well. So I'll hand over to you, Nat. Thanks ever so much for presenting today.
Lovely. So I'm just going to set a timer because I absolutely hate running over time. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here talking with you about this piece. It has just been published in the International Feminist Journal of Politics. And if anybody can't find the link but would like it, then please let me know. So just as a quick kind of overview before I jump into explaining exactly what I've done and why I've done it that way. This is a piece that looks at how arms manufacturers represent different subject positions within their social media feeds, in particular focusing on Twitter. And it's part of a larger project that I'm currently undertaking. I've had another article recently published in Millennium, Journal of International Studies, examining representations of accessibility and transparency within the same feeds. And this one focuses on how women have been represented, in particular making the argument that they are portrayed as neoliberal feminist subjects here, and making the argument that this kind of a representation allows us to see how arms manufacturers almost legitimize themselves within this space. So I'm going to start off by explaining the framework very, very briefly, but I think it would be helpful to just go through some of the concepts that I'm using. As we were saying immediately before we let all of you in, one of the things that I've tried to do in this article is to glue together quite a few different concepts. The core ones that I'm going to go through today with you then are neoliberal feminism and martial politics. Defining neoliberalism using Elizabeth Prugel's definition as a capital-centric logic of governmentality, I've argued that there has been a rise in what we call neoliberal feminism. And this is a type of feminism that is basically focused upon retaining the same social order that we have now, but putting women into that order in ways that allow them to compete more directly with men. So it's very much a kind of business-oriented approach to feminism. I've argued in this piece, the way that I've conceptualized this, that there are two elements that are really key to neoliberal feminism, and these are empowerment and individualism. And I'll say a bit more about how those work a little bit later on in my analysis. Related to this, I argue, is the process broadly of militarization. And I don't know the extent to which all of you will be familiar with that in here, but this is basically the process through which society is socially and politically organized for war. So the processes through which we are persuaded war is a good thing, or not as violent as we might think it is, for example. However, what I'm particularly keen to do here is to expand how we might think of things that relate to militarization. And in order to do this, I make use of Ali Howell's work around martial politics. She has a really great piece out in International Feminist Journal of Politics called Forget Martial Politics, which I forget militarization, focusing on the concept of martial politics, which I highly recommend. And what she's basically arguing here is that we need to be paying broader attention to what she refers to as warlike relations and warlike subject positioning. So instead of looking at things that are related squarely to war, she wants us to focus on things that are of war as well. And that is particularly relevant because I will explain in a second that a lot of the arms manufacturers are very keen to portray themselves as doing anything but war. But the ones that I examine in this particular article actually derive around 85% plus of their revenue from arms sales. So you might think, why is she talking about martial politics and not just militarization? The reason for this is because of how war is obscured within these social media feeds, as Katie was saying. So I look at 3 of the largest arms manufacturers in the world in order to do this, because I like to have a clear sampling strategy, and they are listed on the screen. There was another organization, Boeing, that I opted not to include because during this period, one of their planes crashed, and as a result, that markedly changed their social media output. And that is the subject of another article that I'm co-authoring with Emma Dolan. So I've looked at this over a 3-month period, hand collecting all tweets, approximately 950 from these companies. And in order to do my analysis, I make use of Roxanne Doty's concepts, in particular, the concept of subject positioning. And what that basically means in this context is that I'm asking 2 questions. The first one, how, if at all, are women represented within this kind of a space? And secondly, what do these kinds of representations do? And again, for those of you not familiar with the work of Roxanne Doty, subject positioning is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. How do different subjects relate to each other? And here I'm concerned with the subjects of the arms manufacturers and women as subjects. Still on time, that's good. So I'm going to say a little bit more now about my analysis in this work, focusing on 3 key areas. The first one is around how women are normalized and named in STEM subjects. So, like I was saying, the companies that I've examined were very, very much keen to be representing women as doing scientific jobs. Some of them are discussed in the context of militaries, for example, but a lot of the time they weren't. And within these kinds of representations, what I find is that sex is often unacknowledged in this space. And in a second, I'll say a little bit about the places where it is. But with respect to the places where it's not, what I argue is that this kind of a representation normalizes women within STEM industries and within kind of martial industries more broadly. So what it does is it represents them as just another employee. And what I argue here is that this is normalizing as a process. How do I know that they're women? Well, that is a tricky question, but what I've argued is that it's conveyed here through the use of particular names, through pronouns, she or her, for example, and through images as well. So within this space, what these representations are doing is showing that women are experts, so they're able to answer questions. That's a relatively common framing here. And in doing this, what it is doing is representing women as having a sense of authority. I also found it really interesting here that through this process of normalization, there was also an emphasis on naturalness. And what this meant was that in some instances, women were portrayed as natural born STEM employees because their family had been in STEM. So it was their dad, their mum, etc. When it comes to representations that name women as women, what I argue here is that this is very much related to discourses of empowerment and inspiration. some of these tweets use this sort of terminology quite directly. So several of them refer to empowerment, as in the example on the screen. One of the things I thought particularly interesting within these representations was the way in which these companies were at pains to emphasize that they were being helpful in this regard. So they were taking practical steps to empower women. So, for example, through things like providing scholarships and training around STEM subjects. More broadly, though, I've argued that inspiration can be seen as a kind of wider, slightly more amorphous form of empowerment that really kind of is neoliberal in the way that it is approaching things, because it's aiming to get women to kind of fight for themselves and to push themselves into these spaces. So I've given you another example of this on the screen from Raytheon, which says, inspiring future leaders. Our engineers discussed all things STEM with 160 aspiring female engineers. Beyond this, though, it's not only women that these companies are representing in these feeds, but also girls as well. And there's a particular focus on the empowerment and inspiration of girls. And what I've argued here is basically that that neoliberalism causes girls to need to think about their careers at a young age. It turns them into aspiring worker bees when they're sort of about 10 or 11. And it gets them to aim to have a particular career in life as part of their identity. As a sort of slight tangent there, one of the things that I do in this article is to explore the fact that military recruitment in schools is quite contentious. But it is very much the case that the companies that I'm examining here seem to have ready access to children's spaces. And what I've argued is that it's the fact that these companies they find it easier to represent themselves as less obviously martial than militaries. So what they can do, even though they derive a large proportion of their revenue from the sale of weapons, what they can do is say, oh, this isn't about militaries, it's not about weapons, this is about making environmental monitoring equipment or space rockets, for example. If women and girls are being inspired within these tweets, then who is doing the inspiring? Well, what I have found is that this is almost always a job that is portrayed as being for the female staff of these companies. So what I've argued here then is that the job of empowering and inspiring girls is a form of labor that is placed upon these employees. Okay, and the final element of my findings is the individualization of women's success. And absolutely central to this is the representation of Marilyn Hewson, who is the CEO of Lockheed Martin. And as with other representations that I've mentioned here, most of the time it's not discussed that she's a woman. So there's no references to women or gender. But she is very much central to the representation of Lockheed Martin as being female friendly, because it shows that they are a company where women can be successful, going as far as the very top. Also important here, I've argued, is the representation of women of colour, especially Black women, individual successes that these Black women have. This is particularly the case when it comes to awards that people might have won. So I've given you an example on the screen there. Things like the Black Enterprise Awards are a really important way for these companies to demonstrate that they are a welcoming place for all women, and to show that they are progressive institutions. Interestingly, though, individual successes are sometimes portrayed as female first, so it is linked to a kind of broader representation of women. I've given you an example here that says 57 years after real-life Hidden Figures helped pave the way for the United States to land on the moon, have we made a difference to women in STEM? And the kind of final reflection with respect to the findings here is that a lot of the time the women in question actually go unnamed within discussions about first females. So Mae Jemison, I believe the first Black woman in space, is alluded to in some of these tweets, but is not actually referenced. And I also find it interesting with respect to the tweet that I've discussed there, is that they haven't actually named any of the hidden figures, which means that they are still hidden. So I just wanted to kind of offer some concluding thoughts to draw together what I've been saying. In particular, I would like to make the case that it's really important that we focus on digital media when we're trying to understand what practices of violence are hidden or made possible. What I have done in this particular case is to argue that the process of kind of making martial politics palatable is a very gendered one, and that actually what these companies are doing by representing women in their feeds is to demonstrate that they are progressive institutions. And as a result, I've made the case this functions to forestall critique of violence that they might otherwise receive. And I shall stop there.
Thank you so much, Nat. That was fantastic. And I think really very clearly kind of outlined the key arguments and data from the study. And yes, we've got quite a few little claps going on here that I hope you can see.
Oh, thank you.
So do please ask your questions. If people have questions, you can either raise your hand or write the question in the chat. That's fine. Maybe, do you want to stop sharing your screen, and then we can maybe start to see some people. And if people want to put their cameras on, please do, so we can make it nice and chatty. So I'm going to use my position as chair to ask questions while people think of theirs, but do let me know if you'd like to ask questions. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I don't want to do that kind of question of asking you what you didn't do rather than what you did do, but obviously in the article you're focused on the representations that these arms manufacturers put out there. But I did wonder if you looked at all, even informally, at the kind of responses they were getting. So do we see kind of ridicule and critique, or do we see support from other Twitter users? And did you look at all at this as a kind of space in which, an interactive space, I should say?
That's a really excellent question, and I'm really glad that you've asked me that, because I think this opens a door for us to have a bit of a think about ethics in this space. So I actually did informally look at what people were saying in this space, which I found really, really interesting. So the responses broadly fell into two categories. There were some people who were quite critical of these companies. Sometimes they would respond to dozens of their tweets. And one of the things that I've argued in the other article is that the volume of tweets from these companies functions to obscure some of that negative engagement. Because if you search for at one of these companies, then all of their tweets come up rather than necessarily all of the criticism that they receive. So there is a level of critique. But what I found really surprising is that there are a lot of people who seem to be sort of fans of these companies, and I think fans is almost the right way to describe them in this space. So they would be replying to these tweets with things that I found quite odd, if I'm honest. So things like, oh, that this is an amazing plane, what great specs, things like that, which I will admit I kind of struggled to process as I was looking at these things. And from an ethical perspective, I spent quite a long time just sort of sitting with this data, because I don't recommend this, by the way, but I started this project the day after I submitted my PhD, because my brain, I had nothing else to do, and my brain was just sort of freaking out a bit. So I just started collecting this data to see what was in there. And one of the things that I struggled to know what to do with the most was how people were engaging with them. And I thought, actually, in this instance, I'm not going to focus on this engagement because I don't really know how else to represent some of this engagement respectfully, because it just came across as quite strange to me. The idea that people would spend their time sort of replying to Lockheed Martin and telling them that they liked their planes, or that their satellites looked really good, or people having a sort of discussion amongst themselves about the specs of these particular pieces of equipment. And I think one of the interesting things that some of that reminded me of is Carol Cohn's work, Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals, where people are kind of trying to position themselves as knowledgeable, and sort of constructing a club for themselves by using the language, the right scientific language. So I don't really know what to do with these representations. I didn't collect them for that reason. But it would probably still be possible for me to do so if I decided at some point that I wanted to. But at the moment, I'm not really sure kind of how I ethically approach this kind of thing in this space. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think there's two kind of key points there for any of us doing social media research. Is some of the time we want to look at the interaction, but just the quality of the tweets is sometimes difficult to deal with. But then also the ethics, I think, is also a really important point, because if it's just members of the public, it's a very different situation to a huge company who is using it as a public platform. And as you argue in the article, kind of particularly a company that is causing so much harm and destruction in the world that we can have a position that recognises that as very different to sort of normal members of the public, or possibly bots, of course, that are replying. So I'm interested in this. I mean, you mentioned hidden figures and the idea of them still being hidden. And I think, a lot of what you're looking at is this kind of relationship of the hidden, the visible, and how these women's identities or elements of the women's identities are being constructed in the tweets, but partly to add legitimacy to those companies. And I wondered if you could say something about what elements of identity are the companies hoping to project through this promotion in the way that links to those women.
So I think one of the things that I found most interesting, that I was personally not expecting to find necessarily, is that a significant proportion of the women represented, very significant, are Black women especially. And in terms of kind of the proportion of these companies that they make up, it's not that much. They're disproportionately represented in these feeds, I would say. I don't have the figures exactly for Black women, but I think for Lockheed Martin, 25% of their employees are women. So if we're going to assume that they don't only employ Black women, then it's not that many of them. And yet they're a really significant part of the representations of pretty much all of the companies. When I was doing the process of kind of responding to my peer reviewers for this article, one of them really helpfully suggested that I look at work around neoliberal multiculturalism. So I'm glad you've asked me about this, because I didn't have time to discuss it in my 15 minutes. But neoliberal multiculturalism, I think, dovetails really nicely with representations of kind of neoliberal feminism, because it's basically this idea that, the companies are sort of multiracial. Everybody can make it there if you try. It's a great place for people of color to make an impact. This is a career for you. And actually, I think that is one of the things that I find A, most interesting, but B, also most important in this legitimizing process for these companies. Because one thing that I sort of didn't have enough space to do in the article is to kind of reflect more broadly on what this means in relation to their products. Where are the places that these products are doing the most harm? It's not in the global north. And so what you've got here is you've got representations of these companies sort of fronted by Black women on a kind of in a public way. And then the products are doing harm in places where where most people of color live. So there's a real kind of tension there that I think functions to prevent people from criticizing them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think people that work in advertising have been looking at this idea of moving from sort of marginalization to over-representation, and how that does then feed into that kind of neoliberal idea that you've been talking about. I wanted to ask as well about the discursive approach, so the discursive theoretical approach, because I know, people that do perhaps content analysis or other kind of more systematic approaches. One of the benefits, I think, of a discourse analytical approach is that ability to help you think about the omissions as well, what's included, but particularly the political work that's been done by what's been foregrounded, but also what's been left out as well. I don't know if you could reflect a bit on your choice of method.
Definitely. So I don't know, again, the extent to which any of you are familiar with Roxanne Doty's work, Foreign Policy as Social Construction, but it's probably my favorite kind of conceptual framework to make use of. And there's sort of three key elements that she uses, but I focused in on one here. And I think the reason why I find it so helpful in this space is it enables us to kind of unpack how particular discourses facilitate particular kinds of policies or outcomes, but without necessarily making that causal claim that some kinds of approaches might be making, sort of more statistical ones, for example. So she's arguing that discourses make possible particular outcomes and they prevent other outcomes. And I think, again, sort of drawing upon some of my arguments from the other article, it's particularly interesting to reflect upon what is not contained within these kinds of representations. So on the one hand, you've got lots of representations of sort of women, more broadly, sort of other forms of sort of social progress, so environmental monitoring equipment to help mitigate climate change, a wide variety of kind of progressive representations here, but it's almost entirely unmartial within what is kind of there. So what is omitted in these cases is sort of almost any discussion of war. War is very infrequently discussed. There's some discussion of militaries, but not very often. And it's almost always very technical in what it's describing. So it functions to kind of sanitize what you're seeing by discussing sort of technical specs, for example. So there's sort of very little kind of overt bellicosity within these representations. It's very much a kind of discursive framing of social progress there. And I argue that that's what helps to make possible the arms trade in this case.
Yeah, and I think you also talk about like humanitarianism as well as multiculturalism, and it's almost, you're almost getting into sort of double speak kind of territory where it's where these companies can use that kind of discourse. Okay, there are some questions. Mercy, did you want to say your question, or do you want to unmute? And
okay, hi Natalie, thank you. I really enjoyed that. Very insightful. I have two questions. I'll ask the two at the same time. The first one is that I got the impression that these organizations seek to create an illusion of inclusivity, and but I don't. What's the baseline to belong, to be included? What are the requirements that you need for that to happen? So is this a case of women being included because they're the right men for the job? Do they have to meet certain standards to be included? And then you also mentioned that some of the women are invisible. And I think if they're if they're not identified as, excuse me, as women, their identity is being denied. So that in a way is being ignored. Because if they're not seen and recognized as women, then it's almost as if they're invisible. Thank you.
Shall I answer that one? Or okay, it's really nice to see you. Thank you for coming. So with respect to your first question about how women sort of engage practically with these companies, not to draw too much on other work, but I've got an article that I'm working on with Rosie Walters that uses the framework of gender washing. So what we've done in that piece is to examine how these companies tweet about International Women's Day. And what we've kind of argued in this other piece is that things like that and like the representations I've been talking about here are a type of gender washing, because it's very clear if you look at the International Women's Day tweets that these companies are very keen to talk about all of the women that they have, but very much less keen to talk about how they are sort of how they are engaging with women in a concrete way, and what they're doing for women more broadly. So their International Women's Day tweets largely just kind of discuss the concept of women and womanness, but they don't do much of the kind of discussion about concrete initiatives to get women working for them, for example. There's a bit of that in the tweets that I've looked at for this article, but not so much in the International Women's Day tweets. More broadly, I think this speaks to kind of questions around sort of institutional cultures in organizations like this. And that is something that I admittedly don't know a huge amount about. But more broadly, literature around kind of security cultures, such as the one discussed by Carol Cohn in the article I referred to earlier, would suggest that these environments are quite a bit more male behind the scenes than these companies are happy to project an image of publicly. So in terms of how these companies engage with women, I think that I prefer to sort of stay away from making claims about what is truth, because I think that starts to get a bit slippery, but I don't think that it's massively reflective of the reality of these companies, if I were to kind of be horribly speculative. I hope that answers your questions.
Mercy, did you want to come back at all, or you need to unmute if you want to say something?
No, one of the issues as you're presenting, I kept thinking of some of the work that Cynthia Enloe has done about women in the military, and how even where they claim that women are included, are part of it, the structure, the system, the institution is structured to favor men. So even something as basic as the equipment that they use, the things they're creating, they're actually created with men in mind, so that women have to adjust to fit into that setting. And so in celebrating women, oh, this is a great place to work, this is a great place, and this is what our women are doing, they're capable of doing things, they're capable of answering all the questions. But when they go behind, when they go to the boardroom, when they go into the building, are they recognized and given the space to be women, or do they have to struggle and work hard to be able to fit into the system that was not originally created to accommodate them?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I'm always pleased to hear somebody else talking about Cynthia Enloe. I love Cynthia Enloe's work, and I think that during the process of writing this work up, the connections with the military were really quite interesting, and there were some cases where it was kind of the same, other cases where it was different, but I think the kind of behind the scenes comments about what happens behind the scenes in these organizations is really quite important here, but it's something that I can't make sort of too many claims to knowledge about based on what I'm looking at here. And I guess just to return to your question earlier, Katie, about what the discursive approach does and does not bring, one of the things I don't make any claims about at all is the intent of these companies. And the reason why, again, I avoid making claims about that is because I simply don't know why they've done what they've done. For me, I find it easier to discuss what those representations are and what I argue that they do, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Natalie. Does anyone else have a question? Do you want to raise your hand or unmute? Natalie, you look like you're moving towards?
Yeah, I do have a question. I just wondered if you'd ever cross-referenced the data you have from this study with the gender gap statistics. It just occurred to me when you were talking a couple of questions back about the reason for the representations of women in this way. So basically, are they living up to what they're trying to project on Twitter?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that sort of question is made easier to answer now by things like the gender pay gap bot, which I very much enjoyed, making a nuisance of itself during International Women's Day. But I haven't looked at those statistics, at least not for a little while. So thank you for the reminder. That's a good idea. But if anybody does know what those statistics are, please do feel free to jump in.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? I've got a more general question. James, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, and thank you, Nat, for a really interesting and really clear presentation in terms of your findings. It's really, really fascinating. And I know you said you didn't want to kind of get into the realm of intent necessarily, but I wanted to just kind of ask, I suppose, like when we think about these accounts more generally, what kind of audience are they trying to speak to, and what is, I suppose, their overall strategy when it comes to their use of Twitter? Whether it's kind of like a recruiting role for new employees, are they trying to seek new business through Twitter? Are they trying to counter poor reputational claims? And I wondered kind of how these specific themes around the representation of women intersect with the potential more general themes in terms of why they use these accounts. But yeah, thank you. It was a really, really interesting presentation.
Oh, thank you. A couple of things, sort of reflecting again more broadly on some of the work that I've done in the other projects that relate to this one. One of the things I've kind of said in the Millennium article is that these companies probably aren't trying to persuade the general public that they need to buy a missile. They're probably not thinking, oh, I'm scrolling through Twitter, oh, I've forgotten to buy a missile today. Instead, what I would suggest these companies might be doing is it's an attempt at gaining legitimacy probably within their home countries. So the companies that I've looked at are all based in the United States, and the United States will be regulating its arms industry. And so they need a basis upon which to claim that these companies are behaving in responsible ways in order to allow them to continue selling their products. And so I think this kind of a representation probably does feed into that. The other thing that I would say is that I noted that all of these companies make use of a particular social media management company to do their tweets. I obviously just don't know the extent to which each of the companies would have sort of say over what this intermediate company was doing on their behalf. But I think it is interesting to reflect upon the role of what I've called in another article economies of secrecy. So how this kind of intermediate company is being paid by these companies to represent them in particular ways, or at least prevent other people thinking about them in particular ways as well. So I think that if we're going to think about this in terms of sort of the publics, which is what I've tried to do in the piece that I'm working on with Rosie Walters around gender washing, is to think about potentially who these companies might be targeting. And we think that the answer is probably their home governments, and sort of maybe international organizations as well, to prevent them from targeting them for sanctions or preventing them from exporting their goods, basically.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Thanks, James. I guess this sort of makes me think of the more general question here, and just related to James's question. One of the articles you cite, which is another great article in this area, is Rhys Crilly and Louise Pears's article on the CIA. And so the CIA also have these kind of Twitter accounts. And so you could again argue, who could the CIA be targeting, or what's going on there? And the role as well of these kind of intermediary public relations or promotional industry players is again a fascinating part of it, which often doesn't kind of get the attention that it deserves. And I know Dominic's kind of looked at this historically as well. But I was going to ask, again, because, you're a lecturer in criminology and sociology, and here you are looking at these arms manufacturers on Twitter. And I guess one of the things that interests me a lot is this idea of where international relations take place and where we should be looking, and the shift from looking at nation states or non-state actors to the everyday, and everyday militarism or everyday martial politics, and the role of social media or other spaces in this. And so I just wondered if particularly from the work of feminist scholars, many we've already mentioned, who kind of get us to question where we're looking and what questions we're asking about international relations. So I wondered if you had something to say on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that part of the reason why I find spaces like this so interesting is because I am a feminist, and I do come at these questions from a feminist perspective. And for me, I think the kind of feminist challenge to the public-private dichotomy is one of the things that really function to get me interested in this in particular. So thinking about the role of digital politics in our everyday lives, and how each of us are doing international relations on a daily basis when we engage with companies like this in social media spaces. And what I've argued in this piece is that actually feminist approaches to understanding things like this are particularly helpful, because they highlight the kind of constructed nature of that public-private divide, to show us that international relations can be something that happens at home or on the bus as you're sort of scrolling through Twitter. So I think that it's particularly important to be asking questions about where international relations happens, especially with respect to digital representations and digital politics. So you've mentioned Rhys and Louise's article, which I highly recommend. I believe it's called something like "No, We Don't Know Where Tupac Is." It's really, really good. So I think that there's a sort of burgeoning scholarship that looks at this kind of thing. And it's something that I'm really pleased to see growing, definitely.
Thanks, Nat. Yeah, I think, the whole kind of area of digital diplomacy as well has become really interesting. And just that, publics are very much involved as part of that as well. Natalie, you had another question.
Yeah, thank you. This is really, really interesting, Natalie. Thank you. In particular, my ears pricked up when you mentioned your notion of economies of secrecy and also gender washing, but the economies of secrecy. I think that's similar to something I've been working on about illusions of liberality. How companies, or in my case states, but in your case companies, want to or need to maintain an illusion of liberality for various reasons, and this is a way that companies can do it through their Twitter feed by gender washing, and that is really, really interesting. And I wondered if you had anything else you could add to what you've done. Fascinating. I can't wait to read it.
So That's reminded me that there's a whole literature, in particular, kind of around sort of secrecy and transparency. There's a research network, the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Network, convened by Elspeth van Veeren, that some of you may or may not be aware of. I highly recommend looking at their work and the work that they engage with, because this was something else that was also really helpful for me within this space. Thinking about kind of how again, coming back to this question about binaries, how binaries like secret and not secret are actually a lot more kind of fuzzy than we might think. And I think in the kinds of spaces that you're talking about, sort of illusions of liberality, I think that there's a lot to say with respect to sort of secrecy and transparency. You know, transparency is often represented as a virtue, for example, and ideas around kind of free speech and sort of equal opportunities and such. And it sounds like that kind of ties in quite nicely with what I've done in this piece. So yeah, for you and for everyone else, I would definitely recommend looking at the SPIN network. If anybody needs details for that, you can contact me afterwards. It's like I say, convened by Elspeth, who does some excellent work that might also be helpful in this space.
Thank you.
I know, just sort of linked to that idea of public secrets that Michael Toysig writes about. And that idea of, you know, that everyone knows that war making is kind of about killing, but at the same time we don't really talk about it and we don't mention it. And I know in the book Digital Militarism by Adi Kuntzman and Rebecca Stein, they use that notion of public secrets to talk about militarism in Israel. So yeah, there's so many fascinating strands here. And I wonder if, you know, we've mentioned greenwashing and gender washing, and there's almost something like war washing. I know that's a terrible term, but there's something here about that idea of the technologies and knowledges of war being central, and yet at the same time made completely invisible, like this a public secret in this way.
It's interesting you say that, actually, because the project that I'm working on with Emma Dolan uses the concept of the public secret to look at Boeing's social media, which I took out of the initial project. And what we've basically argued there is that by focusing on the lives lost during a plane crash, where Boeing were, at least at a certain point, apologetic and recognizing the loss of life, focusing on the public secret in that space could potentially highlight where companies like Boeing are not sorry when their products cause fatal harm.
Yeah. I guess there's the thing with and this is something I struggle with as well, is this idea of if we understand kind of war as everywhere and through the actions of these companies and the technologies, and is there a danger that if we just see it everywhere, it becomes difficult to then work with or analyze and make it tangible in ways that we can then, I think, you know, about seeing that political work, and maybe this is what discourse theory helps us with as well, because there's a danger sometimes I kind of find in my own writing as well of kind of, if we just say, well, it's just all about war and these companies are evil, and, you know, but we still need to figure out how to kind of go beyond that, I guess. I don't know if you kind of struggle with this a little bit as well.
Yeah, and sort of how, if it is everywhere, how we respond to that, what that kind of means for us as people who are sort of invested in, I guess, sort of preventing loss of life at the kind of core of it. And I don't have an answer to that. I think, as you say, it's really, really difficult. And for me, I guess kind of functioning in broader ways to highlight the more sort of subtle ways in which society might be militarized is my way of contributing in a small way to, I guess, kind of chipping away at that. But more broadly, it does feel like a very difficult thing to approach, definitely. And I don't have any other answers. Maybe somebody else in the audience does.
Mercy, do you have the answer?
No, I don't. Because as they're talking, something that just kind of crossed my mind is the, looking at it from the media perspective, that when you have this illusion of transparency, it's almost as if the media have nothing to investigate. And because they're now, in a way, bypassing the gatekeepers, they're able to represent themselves the way they want to be seen. And so, in a way, it's manipulating technology, the power that are now able to present themselves, tell their own stories, create their own narratives, in a way, distracting the media from wanting to find out. I mean, that's the impression that the thought that came to my mind, and just trying to think, how much are we investigating what is going on? There's some of these areas that I don't remember reading any detailed, story or narratives from the media, because it's almost like they're telling their own stories, they're creating their own narratives.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I find particularly interesting, sort of beyond this context, is the extent to which media is happy to reproduce discourses like the ones I've looked at in an uncritical way. You see this a bit more kind of commonly with respect to the military and the police, for example. But I think it's a really important point to highlight the kind of relationship between these organizations and the broader media. In sort of highlighting how we need to pay attention to social media spaces. It's not to say that we shouldn't also be focusing on kind of more traditional media as well. And I think that's a really important point you're making there about how these companies are sort of portraying themselves as sort of beacons of transparency, which is something I've tried to discuss elsewhere as well. And then how that gets picked up by other actors or maybe other states or the media itself, I think is something that definitely bears further reflection.
Oh, Hannah, do you have a question?
I do, yeah. Sorry for no camera. I'm having a sick day on the sofa, so you don't need to see that. But Nat, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. I think one of the things that particularly struck me about it was kind of and it's building upon what we've just discussed, right, is the kind of nefarious presence of these arms manufacturers in schools and educational spaces, which really struck me as something, because I work on the military, as you know, and kind of that, like you say, is kind of this known controversy, right? But I think with the arms manufacturers, less so. And I was wondering if any of the kind of media feeds featured like the college space or the university space at all. And if you've discussed this with any of your students at Gloucestershire and kind of how they might have reacted to that. It's just, I'm just kind of curious about how people are reacting to this.
It's interesting you ask about the kind of different education spaces. It's nice to see you, by the way. So the feeds themselves were very much focused on quite young people. So in particular, girls who were sort of about 10, maybe up to about 15. But kind of in terms of college spaces, there wasn't very much contained within these feeds. I'm not sure, maybe a little bit, but most of it was focusing on sort of really quite young girls. And I think the logic behind that is perhaps revealed by one of the people in one of the videos that I looked at, which said that you have to get them when they're young, which I thought was very revealing. But I think that probably speaks to the approach that these companies are taking, which is to kind of start engaging with these girls from a young age. And then maybe when they hit 18, they might take a tech program at their university, or they might just go and work for them. So it's interesting that kind of space is not discussed very much there. In terms of what my students would think about this, I think that the presence of sort of companies like this in universities is a bit contentious. But I think that my students would probably sort of apply a critical lens to this and be asking, you know, what the role of organisations like this is, and making their own mind up about whether or not to engage with them.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad my camera wasn't on for some of the faces I was making through that. There was shock. Thank you, Nat.
Thanks, Hannah. Just to say, Dominic's also put a link in the chat about the internet coming together to mock one of the CIA's adverts. And I think, you know, I guess as well as having certainly, I'm trying to think, is it declassified is a very good sort of source for articles that do question the military. But if the legacy media aren't doing the job of questioning some of these stories and these narratives around these companies, maybe the public mocking them is one of our hopes. Dominic, I don't know if you wanted to come in and say anything.
Yeah, I saw that it was on the listening post a few months ago. They had a piece about the parody, and it was and as Natalie says, you wonder how representative that particular person, the CIA officer in question, was of the organisation. I suspect not very much at all, and it's part of a wider picture, isn't it? I mean, in the current tragic conflict, various conflicts. I mean, it's quite interesting how prominent the Russians is a spokeswoman, you know, and also in another context, Lauren Boebert is a representative of the NRA. Women are very much coming to the fore in these debates. I mean, there's a big, I don't know if it's a big pivot, but a noticeable change was, I mean, 20 years on the anniversary of Iraq, was how many, you know, discourses around women's liberation in relation to Afghanistan. It's quite tragic and horribly ironic now thinking about that. But that was very much the discourse. Both, I recall Laura Bush and Sherry Booth both being, you know, at least part of the narrative at that time, precisely for this reason. So this is really important. And you know, tracking all this stuff as you're doing, Natalie and other colleagues, it's really, really interesting, isn't it? Because you can see a pattern here. A very prominent pattern to, you know, and yeah, so yeah, I really found that very interesting, that talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess just to kind of highlight here, I think that the role of sort of neoliberalism broadly conceived is quite useful in highlighting sort of how women have ended up in that position. This idea very much that, you know, you can make it to the top, you can do whatever you want, which I think kind of fits with some of the kind of wider global discourses around sort of imperialism as well.
Thank you so much. I am aware that it's 5 o'clock. My dog is whinging in the other room because he wants to go for a walk. So unless anyone has any final words, I think you can tell, Nat, that we've really enjoyed it and found that absolutely fascinating, and it's given us a lot to think about. And I think it's great to be really expanding how we're conceiving of kind of media and politics. And obviously this brings in very much an interest of mine as well. So thank you so much. It's been fantastic. Really enlightening, and thank you to everyone for joining. And we hope, I'm not sure if we've got another seminar planned yet. No, so we've obviously got the conference in April, and so we'll think about more seminars after that. But if anyone does have an article or a book or a subject that they'd like to propose, please do let us know. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.